They're the new king of this motherfucker now, and it's right here, all right?
He's down! He has done it! It is all over!
When people talk about who are the biggest stars in mixed martial arts, the name Nate Diaz almost certainly gets mentioned, or at least it should. In fact, even discussions about the biggest draws in combat sports altogether will likely include the Stockton star's name. After all, in Diaz, we're talking about a fighter who has over 2 million followers on Twitter and over 6 million followers on Instagram. That's a following not many athletes in major sports leagues can boast of, let alone in mixed martial arts. Since Diaz joined the UFC all the way back in 2009, he's gone on to become a household name in combat sports, on account of his nasty submission game, dangerous boxing, and of course, his brash tells it like he sees it persona. Yeah, we would be remiss if we didn't also cite all the Stockton slaps Diaz has fired along the way as to why he's become somewhat of an anti-hero for the game. But what contributed to Diaz becoming as big of a deal as he is? What are the most epic UFC moments Diaz has been part of to date? Well, before we get into that, if you enjoy this video, be sure to like it and to subscribe to KO Central MMA. All set? Let's take a look at Diaz's defining and greatest UFC moments. Winning The Ultimate Fighter Season 5. Unless you're an old school fan who's been following MMA for well over a decade, you won't remember a time when Diaz wasn't on the UFC roster. But way back in 2007, the MMA world was buzzed by the news that Nate Diaz was going to compete in the 5th season of The Ultimate Fighter. While Nate wasn't a huge name in MMA at that juncture, his older brother Nick already was, and so there was a lot of interest in how the star's younger brother would do in the competition. Nate proceeded to showcase that just like Nick, the 22-year-old's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu game was already ridiculously dangerous. Diaz went on to submit Rob Emerson, Corey Hill, and then future rival Gray Maynard to advance to the tough finals. The finale against Manny Gamburian was kind of anticlimactic as Gamburian incurred a shoulder injury and Diaz was awarded the fight. But at the end of the day, Diaz won tough and his eventual path to superstardom was entrenched, tapping out Kurt Pellegrino and flipping the double birds. In Diaz's third fight after winning Tough 5, he was matched up against lightweight contender Kurt Pellegrino. Due to Pellegrino's wrestling credentials and because he was also a decorated jiu-jitsu practitioner, at the time a lot of people wondered if he'd be too much for Diaz. Well, not only did Diaz drop jaws by catching Pellegrino with a highlight reel, triangle choke in round 2, he prompted a collective roar in the MMA world by triumphantly giving the finger with both of his hands. Was Diaz telling Pellegrino's fans off? Could it have been for the UFC brass? Who knows? But the moment quickly went viral and has been shown a gazillion times since. Dominating Cowboy. By the time Diaz was booked to fight Donald Cerrone in 2011, fans and observers were already very aware that, just like his brother Nick,
I want to give a shout out to my brother Nick Diaz, the man, the main man. They're the new king of this motherfucker now, and it's right here, all right?
Nate wasn't afraid to speak his mind whenever, wherever, and in front of whomever. Case in point, prior to their scrap, Cerrone reported the following about a run-in he had with Diaz. Really, the only personal interaction I've had with Nate is at the open workouts prior to this fight. I walk over to be like, hey man, what's going on? Shake his hand. He slaps my hand away, calls me a punk ass, walks off. Classic Diaz. What was also classic Diaz was the sharp boxing he showcased in his UFC 141 bout with Cowboy. The Stockton slugger pummeled Cerrone from the get-go, and while he was unable to stop his foe, he outstruck him by a whopping 260 to 104 margin. It was a pivotal victory for Diaz, as at the time, both he and Cerrone were widely regarded as two of the rising lightweight stars in the UFC, destroying Gray Maynard. Following Diaz's impressive win over Cerrone, he went on to submit the always tough Jim Miller. Talk of title contention really started to spike, but that buzz dissipated after Diaz dropped consecutive fights to Benson Henderson and Josh Thompson. So, when Diaz was tapped for his rubber match with Gray Maynard in 2013, there was a lot riding on the line. Not only was Diaz looking to prevent losing a third straight fight for the first time in his career, he and Maynard had a long, less than amicable relationship that dated all the way back to Tough 5. Well, not only did Diaz return to the win column in November 2013, he turned heads throughout MMA by taking out Maynard in less than one round. It was another defining moment for the Stockton pugilist, dominating Michael Johnson and then calling out Conor McGregor. After the Maynard win, Diaz went on to fight Rafael dos Anjos next, and he proceeded to drop a decision loss to the future champ. On account of Diaz's already massive and loyal fan base, a loss to Johnson certainly wouldn't have been catastrophic for him, but a defeat would have punted one of the most iconic and greatest post-fight callouts the game has ever seen. More on that in a minute. Diaz squared off with Johnson in December 2015, who, while he was coming off a split decision loss to Beneil Dariush, had won 4 in a row prior to that. Johnson's hand speed and precision had given more than a few notable lightweights all sorts of problems over the years, and some questioned if that would indeed be the case for Diaz. Well, once again, Diaz silenced his doubters as he outscored Johnson for the decision win. It was an epic fight on account of the striking exchanges, but also because Diaz relentlessly taunted Johnson throughout the fight. But what most people likely remember first and foremost about that fight today is what Diaz had to say in his post-fight interview. The star proceeded to call out Conor McGregor, helping set in motion 2 of the game's biggest fights ever. The West Coast hero fired his challenge to McGregor, who at that juncture had yet to lose in the UFC, and was coming off his historic and massive knockout of the legendary Jose Aldo.
Yeah, Conor McGregor, you're taking everything I work for. I'm gonna fight your ass. You know what's the real fight, what's the real money fight is me, not these clowns that you already punked at the press conference. Don't no one want to see that, you know you beat them already. That's the easy fight. You want that real right here.
Yup, as would be emphatically proven, Diaz versus McGregor was indeed the money fight to make, subbing the notorious Conor McGregor. Now, what some newbie and/or casual fans may not realize is that despite Diaz's now legendary call-out of McGregor, the two were not originally expected to fight in 2016. Following McGregor's 13-second destruction of Aldo, the UFC tapped the new featherweight champ to fight the current lightweight king, Rafael dos Anjos, in March 2016. But following a foot injury that forced RDA to withdraw not far out from the fight, the UFC eventually dialed Diaz's number after several other fighters reportedly turned down the short notice opportunity. Diaz, who had apparently been partying and vacationing in Mexico, agreed to throw hands with McGregor in a welterweight contest, and the super fight was born. Due to the fact that McGregor was coming up from featherweight, there were some who questioned how he would do performing at 170 pounds, especially since Diaz had competed at welterweight in the past. But on account of McGregor's meteoric rise in the UFC, the Irish fighter was still a considerable favorite to defeat Diaz. Early on at UFC 196, it looked like that might be the case, as McGregor landed several thumping shots and bloodied the Stockton star. But Diaz and his granite chin kept coming, while McGregor faded considerably in round 2. Not long after Diaz stunned the notorious one with one of his trademark 1-2s, McGregor shot in a desperate attempt to take the fight down. It was the beginning of the end for the superstar, as Diaz quickly went to work and locked in a fight-ending choke. Footage of the bloody Diaz tapping McGregor and then approaching the camera has become one of the most watched clips in our solar system's history, as has Diaz proclaiming after the win,
Hey, I'm not surprised.
It's hard to argue, really, that this was the biggest win of Diaz's career, as well as his most defining, impactful moment. The fight was one of the biggest in UFC history, as it's believed to have sold over 1.3 million pay-per-view buys. Further, it set in motion Diaz-McGregor 2, which took place a few months later that August. Although McGregor won the rematch via majority decision, Diaz collected another massive payday, as that fight's believed to have sold 1.6 million pay-per-view buys. Fighting for the BMF title and telling The Rock he can get it too. Although Diaz didn't return to the octagon until 2019, he remained, as he does today, one of the biggest names in the game. Following a victory over Anthony Pettis, he was booked to fight fellow fan favorite Jorge Masvidal for the symbolic baddest motherfucker title. It was a matchup Diaz called for, and not surprisingly, Masvidal and legions of fans were all in. The entertaining fight ended on a sour note, as it was called off due to a large cut Diaz had incurred over his eye. But in true Diaz fashion, he wasn't done entertaining. The outspoken fighter proceeded to spray verbal fire at Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who was there to award the BMF belt, and who was also a Masvidal supporter.
F The Rock too, man. That motherfucker over here playing me. See him over here smiling with Masvidal. Should have had Mike Tyson handing out a belt if anybody. I didn't give a f about no belt anyway, but he could get it too. You guys caught me under a bad time, but you know what I'm saying? The Rock's cool. I like ballers. You know what I'm saying? But he picked the wrong side. He picked another side, so he could get it too. He could get his ass whipped too. Straight up. With all due respect, he could get it too.
What will the Jake Paul chapter mean for Diaz? As it stands right now, Diaz is no longer on the UFC roster, as the star elected to fight out his deal with the promotion so he could pursue other lucrative opportunities, like a boxing match with YouTube celebrity turned pugilist Jake Paul, who Diaz will box on August 5th. Now, Diaz has said he's interested in returning to the UFC in the future, but it remains to be seen if the 38-year-old will do so, especially since the consensus seems to be that Diaz is going to make another truckload of cash in that fight, and because if he wins, another big payday via boxing is likely to materialize. But what do you think? Will we see Diaz back in the octagon again and recording more epic moments? Do you think he'll hand Paul another defeat in the ring? Let us know in the comments section below, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and subscribe to KO Central MMA.